Oh, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where I should remember to put the microphone in front of me. See, there it is. I'm always talking about it. But I don't, and I never will. And that's the way the world turns. So today I want to talk about something that's always fascinated me. And I think once we delve into it a bit more, it will fascinate some of you, the audience, as well. And this is how non-musical trends, non-musical things end up impacting the way that music is made and the way that music is consumed and enjoyed. And to start with, let's go back before the 19th century because modernity as we know it was more or less born in the 19th century. Traditional European historians cite the beginning of the late modern era as the commencing of the French Revolution in 1789. But from a technological point of view, it was really the 19th century where patterns of consumption and production and craftsmanship started to kind of sort of smell like the way we're used to, even though obviously there were many similarities before. So before this 19th century era, what was the typical way music was received? And I consciously do not say consumed because that is a later commercial trend. So music was received in the following places. There were what I call folkish settings. And this could be, a town square, someone's home, your friend's home, outside a church, some sort of drinking area. And this is there are, replace drinking area with some other sort of festive ground, and you'll see trends that are similar around the world in terms of where music is consumed or received, rather, if we're going to be really technical about it. Now, where else would music have been received before the late modern era? Well, in liturgical settings, in spiritual settings, in a church, if we're talking about Europe and the wider Christian world, or in a temple in China or Japan, etc. We see holy settings and then in officious settings. So in official places, parliaments, palaces, castles, presidential homes, all of these sorts of things. Now, noticeably absent was the live music venue, because prior to the 19th century, the live music venue was a much smaller deal, both in terms of size, in terms of importance, and in terms of economics than it became. But as the 19th century rolled on, the concert hall became a thing, and it became a lucrative thing that was also very central to the artistic development of music. Now, this happened for several reasons. As living standards increase, as they did in Europe and North America and in a few other places as well, people get more interested in spending money on the arts. I maintain that art is not a luxury, it is a necessity. But big spending on the arts, we can say, is kind of both a necessity and a luxury ultimately. And so living standards were rising. And so with that comes more investment in the arts. The other thing that was happening is the music itself was changing. Beethoven had crossed a point of no return with his symphonies, beginning with the Third Symphony, when Beethoven really became the symphonic Beethoven we know and love, and obviously ending in the Ninth Symphony, that larger than life, one of the finest, if not the finest pieces of music, or maybe all of art ever made. And this necessitated changes in the way that music was played. The musicians needed to become better, they needed to become more professionalized. The concert halls needed to accommodate the excitement around this kind of music, and in turn, orchestras needed to get bigger, as they did in the mid and late 19th century, in order to fill these halls and really give the sonic weight that the compositions of people like Beethoven demanded. And here we see that it wasn't necessarily one thing leading to another, but it was several things sort of working in consort with each other. It's a classic chicken and egg thing. Did the higher living standards and the demands of Beethoven and post Beethoven music create the demand for the concert hall, or were the sociological implications of higher living standards and the fortitude of great minds like Wagner, did they make this change? And I think the answer is a bit of both. Wagner clearly, though, is the most important single individual in the development of what we now consider the modern music listening space, the concert hall, the music venue. Because Wagner was insistent that the modern music venue not only be acoustically superior and not only have staging that could accommodate anything that both a composer, a librettist, and performers could demand, but he also introduced the idea of egalitarianism in the music venue because at his insistence the Bayreuth opera house that was built specifically to perform Wagner's operas, it didn't have segregated boxes the way that you would see in older venues like La Scala in Milan. Instead you just see sort of a slope the way that you would at a stadium or an arena where the audience sat. And so, this idea that anyone who can afford a ticket can go and have an equal line of vision, an equal place in an acoustically sound venue, that there's no more social hierarchy. You pays your money, you gets your show. And that was very, very important because it meant that this was the beginning of music for the masses. And we see that architecture played a role in influencing the music because composers now felt the desire, maybe even the need to compose bigger pieces in terms of dynamics and overall sonics to fill these architectural spaces. But on the other hand, these architectural spaces developed because music was getting more complex, bigger, louder. And so all of these things happen somewhat simultaneously. And I think that that's an important thing to contextualize. And this trend that Wagner started continued throughout the 19th century. And at the end of the 19th century, we have two really important inventions. We have recorded sound being invented, and we have the self playing instruments, like the player piano, most famously. Now, the early sound recordings of the wax cylinders sounded really bad. They were not any substitute for live music. But what they did set in motion is for the first time the idea of music without being physically near a musician. That was unique and novel. And there were predecessors to it, the music box, a predecessor that was music without a musician, but it was really recorded sound that really made that a prominent thing introduced to society. And around about the same time, you had the player piano, which not only brought music without a musician into any space where you put the player piano, but the player piano didn't have any sonic problems. It sounded great because it was an actual piano played mechanically based on music rolls that were the imprints of what actual musicians were playing. So, in many ways, for the first 30 or maybe even 40 years of recorded sound, you could make a strong argument that self-playing instruments, and again, the player piano was the most important one, was in many ways a far superior way of achieving realism in terms of music without the musician being present. Now, at the same time, the theater organ or the cinema organ became much bigger than ever before. The late 19th and early 20th centuries was when these theater organs became bigger than ever before. And they were important in that they served the function of one musician fulfilling a role that would have normally been fulfilled by 30, if not 80 musicians. Because in terms of dynamics, diversity of sound, in terms of some of early mechanical automation techniques, these theater organs made by companies like Wurlitzer, for instance, really were designed to replace an orchestra. Now, this was an economic consideration as much as anything else, because even though the organ is the biggest, most cumbersome, and most expensive instrument ever, the savings are made because one musician can fulfill the role of many. Now, the organ is, of course, one of the oldest instruments ever, and it long predates these modern theater organs. Even before this era, the concert organ and the church organ kept getting bigger and bigger because as technology improved and as the musicians playing the organ improved, people wanted bigger, more sophisticated organs, even in traditional concert and, more importantly, in liturgical settings. A wonderful instrument. I have to say, it's the organ itself and all of its different varieties is my favorite instrument of all time. But these theater organs were unique because they were coming out at the same time as the player piano and recorded sound. Everyone was sort of kicking it up a notch. Everyone was trying to get the most bang for their buck. And then the next things that happened, which both happened in a real sense in the 1920s, were the electrification of sound recording. This meant that you had a microphone rather than one of those big horns to record the sound. It meant that you were recording things electronically on several formats, but the most prominent one came to be the shellac disc. But you also had recordings on optical film sound recordings. This was pre-tape, pre-magnetic film. And the improvement between the acoustic recordings that you had previous to this and the electronic recordings, it was night and day. Some might argue it was an even bigger leap than the leap from pre-magnetic recording, pre-tape, to the age of tape. But we'll get there in a minute, ladies and gentlemen. So the other thing that happened that electricity made possible was the radio. So the recorded sound that you could get on a 78 record, this was now music without a musician. And rather than just having a player piano play only the piano, you could hear any instrument that someone shoved a microphone in front of. You could hear the voice of a famous singer without traveling to see that singer. That seems so pedestrian today, but that was a big deal in the 20s. The idea that someone like Enrico Caruso, the most famous singer of the first half of the 20th century, that you could listen to him without being in the same place as him, not even in the same continent as him in some cases. That was novel. And radio was interesting because radio made it so that you had someone curating music who wasn't a musician, was a radio DJ. Normally, it would be a musician deciding what music you hear. Radio brought in the middleman that was a DJ that said, I think that you should hear this. And obviously, the good DJs, whether in the 1920s, the 1970s, or any other time, they were the ones who said what they wanted to say and play what they wanted to play, as Tom Petty said on his song The Lost DJ about the wonderful Jim Ladd. But there are also other interests, commercial interests. For instance, or worse yet, political interests. And my how things haven't changed. So that was radio. So now we're in an age where music is portable, much more so than it had ever been before. It used to be that you needed to go to the music, which meant that you needed to go to the musicians, you needed to befriend musicians who would come to where you are, or you needed to become a musician yourself. A lot of people entertain themselves by playing a piano or a guitar or anything else, and people still do today, but the difference was prior to all of this stuff happening, that was the only way to do it. But now the music is portable in the sense that a 78 record that you can hold in your hand, hold under your arm, can be brought anywhere. A radio station is going to play the same music, whether you're listening to it at your house or at Bob's house over there. And obviously, the equipment isn't portable. The Walkman hasn't been invented yet. But again, the idea of mobility, very, very important. The next big invention was magnetic tape, because magnetic tape really allowed people to hear a kind of realism approaching live performance that previous recording technologies like shellac and optical film just couldn't produce. Now, the first company that pioneered this was a German company called Magnetophone. Sometimes it's pronounced magnetophone, but magnetophone is what I believe the correct pronunciation. And And through a lot of their experiments throughout the 30s and 40s, late 30s into the 40s, they improved the sound a lot. They figured out how AC bias correction is something you needed to do to make the tape truly high fidelity. And by 1944 and 45, you even had magnetophone equipment that was making stereo recordings. And some of these are available. Most were sadly lost because this was taking place during the Second World War, and war isn't very fun. But some of these stereo recordings survived. There's one of Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto, piano being played by one of my favorites, Walter Geskerling, and conducted by one of the greats, Wilhelm Furtwängler. You may remember him from previous episodes of this show. And then there's another a recording that survived, which is only the fourth movement of Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, conducted by a comparatively young Herbert von Karajan. And so the sound quality on those recordings, very good. Now, after the war, this technology was stolen, and some of it was brought to Moscow, and some of it was brought to Illinois. And the person who brought it to Illinois formed Ampex. And Ampex was an early pioneer in so much high fidelity recording in terms of tape, whether audio tape, later on videotape, and just about anything else. They were a real pioneering company. And the industry at first thought, what are we going to do with this newfangled tape? And the person who really pushed for it was Bing Crosby. So here we have an instance of the technology influencing how music is consumed, because this magnetophone technology, magnetic tape, allowed for high fidelity recordings, and that same technology, when improved to stereo recordings, being heard at a level that really came, and on these good recordings, it came pretty close to the live experience, with the stipulation that nothing ever fully approximates the live experience. So Bing Crosby was a very important man from the music world who said, let's use this technology because it will improve the way that music can be consumed, and it will mean that radio broadcasts will be improved, because when you're syndicating a show, recording it to a shellac disc or an optical films recorder won't sound as good as a radio station recording the live broadcast onto tape. Recording a radio broadcast onto tape, very little is lost. It sounds pretty much just as good. And so tape, huge invention. And then at around the same time, the long playing record got invented, which not only improved the sound quality vis-a-vis the 78 disc, but it allowed for entire pieces of music to be played on one disc. The reason that we still call albums albums is because 78s were sold in what looked like a photo album, because to get a series of songs or a symphony or an opera together, it took multiple 78 discs, and they were sold in what looked like photo albums. Voila, the LP comes at the end of the 1940s, and you have all of that stuff that used to be in an album on one disc, but we still called it an album. And even now that the LP is old technology, we still call a collection of music in one place an album. And that's why. So the LP was very influential, although its immediate influence on musical artists came later. Its immediate benefit was to music consumers because it made the sound better, and it was more convenient because you had side A and side B rather than so many discs in an album of 78s. Flash forward to the 50s, and we're now also getting to the era where we're selling tape to consumers. Magnetic tape, usually running at 7.5 inches per second. This sounds really good. A well-recorded tape that you can get from a company, we're in the 50s now, like RCA or Decca London or Mercury or Westminster, all of these companies pioneering high fidelity. And because the fidelity was so great, they put out a lot of music that really showed this off. So there was a lot of orchestral music, a lot of operatic music, and the sound is amazing. We're getting to an era now where sound got pretty much as good as it was ever going to get. And now the question was, are there easier ways to do it? Because I would maintain that as good as modern sound recording of the 21st century is, it's hard to really sound better than some of these great magnetic stereophonic recordings of the 50s. It's just about how do we do it in an easier way. But that really set such a huge standard because it was in this mid 50s era when sound got, in many ways, as good as it was going to get. But other things to do with convenience and experimentation were around the corner, as was the advent of the stereo LP, which again not only improved sound quality, but created a bigger sound stage because of separation. Some people still love mono, to each their own. I say stereo was an improvement. So we're now in the late 50s and early 60s, and we're getting into an era of multi track recording. And this was pioneered by a musician. In particular, it was pioneered by the guitarist Les Paul, for whom the Les Paul guitar is named. I know that sounds implausible. He wanted to overdub, so he wanted to lay down a track, play over it, have someone sing over it, which became totally common practice in the music industry, but it was unheard of at the time. And so his experiments led to the advent of multi track recording. And at first, it started with 4 tracks. And by the end of the 60s, we had 8 tracks. And then by late 60s, early 70s, we also had people pioneering 16 tracks. Frank Zappa was one of the first to use a 16 track. And then by the early to mid 70s, the 24 track became the gold standard. So, what did this do in terms of recording? Well, remember when I said that recorded sound meant you could receive music without being in the presence of a musician? Well, now you could make music without being in the presence of other musicians. It now became theoretically possible for a one man band to exist without that one man playing all the instruments at once. You think of Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins. But now you don't need that. You could have or you could lay down a guide track, bass and drums, have the guitar player come in, have the keyboard player come in, and do it all separately. And bands whose members didn't like each other by the 70s were taking advantage of this, albeit most bands in the sort of rock world, and definitely in the jazz world and the soul world, were still in the 70s recording together. By the end of the decade and into the 80s, recording separately became a bit more popular. But even without recording separately, you could overdub, which simply means you record a song and then I want to put another guitar solo on top of that. You can do that with multi-track. Or I want to add some harmony vocals. You can do that. I want to add some sound effects. You can do that. And so Les Paul in the 50s inventing multi-track, and then by the late 60s and 70s, it had become the standard type of recording for just about every form of popular music. For classical and for some jazz, it became less common. But even in some of the classical labels by the late 60s were recording with 4 channels. Now, they were doing it all live, meaning no overdubs, but they were using the channels to create better separation and better ability to manipulate various aspects of the recording. So you could put all of the mics going to the string section on track 1, the percussion track 2, the brass track 3, the woodwinds track 4, and manipulate it if you so wanted to do so. And the sub-label most famous for that, it was a sub-label of Decca, or London as it was called in North America, and this was called Phase 4. And there were a lot of good recordings on it. The sound is spectacular. Some thought it was a bit gimmicky, and it was, compared to a more traditional live classical recording that wouldn't have much manipulation, the kinds of things you'd see on the Decca SLX series. Same thing as the London Bluebacks, RCA Living Stereo, Mercury A Living Presence. But the Phase 4 stuff was pretty cool and spectacular, and you had Stokowski and a lot of other very good conductors doing that. So multi-track recording became the rule for almost every genre, but certainly for genres of popular music. Now, all throughout this time, people had more interesting ways to consume music, because by the time we get to the 60s, we're in the golden age of the home stereo. And by the 70s, it was really an era where it was a status symbol. If you had your Macintosh, different, nothing to do with Steve Jobs, MCINTOSH, or a Marantz or a Sansui or any of these brands, if you had your Altec Lansing or your JBL speakers, later in the decade, your Bowers and Wilkins, or your Vandersteens, two great brands that began in the late 70s. Back to the early 70s, you also had brands like Klipsch, like Tannoy, all of these that were doing big things. It was a status symbol. And if you were cool, you had a good stereo system because everyone liked music. And to prove how much you like it, you want to play it back in the best way possible. And the difference between your lowly, sort of off the shelf, all in one stereos at that time and your expensive stuff, it was huge. There wasn't really any mid fi in those days. It was low fi stuff that you'd maybe buy for your kid, or if you're a young person, struggling to make ends meet. But if you were in a position to have your own home and your own car, which even in the 70s, as bad as the economy turned after the Bretton Woods Agreement collapsed and the closing of the gold window by Nixon, it was still, for most people, a time of better living standards than today, comparatively. Some would argue that, but, bring it on. But it was a status symbol, and the technology got really, really good, really, really fast. So it became a status symbol. So, what we've seen from the mid 19th century up to the mid 20th century has really been the constant tale of music becoming more important in people's lives, more lucrative, more diverse options, and more portable. You could take it with you. Now, in the late 70s, this dominance of music was challenged. Music still was huge, but it was challenged by video. Video killed the radio star. Now, what do I mean by video? I'm talking about several things. And I'm specifically talking about the advent of the home video cassette recorder, the VCR, which by the late 70s, it was still very expensive, much more cost prohibitive than even a pretty decent record player or tape player, whether a beautiful audiophile open reel player or a cassette player, which is below an LP in the pecking order of audio quality. But they eventually became very popular. Betamax was the first format that was big, and then a lower quality format called VHS became the main one. And even though the videos were quite expensive, it took off, and the rental market took off. And so all of a sudden, now you could take visual drama home with you. You didn't need to go to a stage. You didn't need to even go to a cinema, a movie theater. You could take the visual drama home with you. And the advent of cable television around this same time, and the popularity of C-band satellite television that was growing in the late 70s and really grew in the 80s. C-band television with those big satellite dishes, the huge ones that were like bigger than a man, bigger than a beast, as opposed to the ones that are like this that came in the 90s. You saw a challenge to music. But music adapted, and it still was something that everyone had their favorite band. And a lot of it was helped by the fact that music videos had always been made, but now they had a permanent home. Instead of being shown on a special or on, let's say, a segment of a talk show like Ed Sullivan, who mostly had live music, but they would show videos on these. And particularly in Europe, where the budgets weren't as big, there would be a lot of music videos rather than flying the band over. Now there was with MTV a permanent place for visualizations of music, the music video. So did video really kill the radio star? Well, it didn't hurt the music business. It actually helped the music business a lot. I personally think Michael Jackson's Thriller, because of its great production, great writing, great performance, iconic musicianship of Michael himself, obviously, I think would have always been big. But that was really an album that went hand in hand with MTV, because Michael Jackson always specialized in very cinematic music, and he loved the visual arts, and the videos that were associated with the top hits on Thriller were all over the airwaves. So you see video and audio generally getting along. people had criticisms. Oh, the video takes away from the audio experience, and oh, the uglier musicians who might be really talented are being replaced by the pretty ones. Those were real arguments. But the point is that music survived. And in the 90s, music would continue to survive, but the record labels started to get greedy. The compact disc came out in the 80s, and by the beginning of the 90s, it had supplanted both the record and the cassette as a format that was the format of choice for people who wanted both quality and portability. Because one of these stories, one of these narratives, if you will, is that the quality was generally always going up, as was the portability. Now, obviously, there are people who say analog sound is the best, CDs aren't. I'll do a whole episode on that. I think I already have, but we can always do another one. But the CD was king by the 90s, but the record labels got greedy. The CD was much cheaper to make than the tape or the record, but they were charging a lot for it. Really a lot. And to show you how much they were charging, even with inflation, everything is more expensive. Fuel for the car, the cars themselves, houses, groceries, furniture, everything is more expensive today than it was in the 1990s. Not the compact disc, because the record labels were just sticking it to the consumer in the 90s, as were the chain stores. They were all in on it. And this led to Napster saying, look, the technology is now here. We can share this music. And while, yeah, it's a matter of convenience more than price, the price points of CDs in the 90s, I think, had a lot to do with Napster's success. So now what you have with Napster is even more portability. You still need a playback device, the computer, obviously, sometimes plugged into a hi-fi system, a big stereo, but you still need the playback system. But now music has become so portable, you don't even need a physical media, because the hard drive where the Napster stuff is stored on the P2P network is integral to the computer. It's not a standalone storage device for music the way records, tapes, and CDs were. And this sent the music industry into a panic from which they've never recovered. And so now we're seeing, for the first time in this narrative, things becoming smaller financially. It was from Wagner all the way up to the compact disc, which was whose format was solidified by Herbert von Karajan, who loved technology. Every time a new recorded technology came to the market, he would re-record all of his main repertoire, and he was responsible for the CD being having 92 minutes or approximately that, 92, 93 minutes of music, because that's about how long it took him to conduct Beethoven's Ninth, and he wanted that piece all on one storage medium, no flipping of the sides, no record one and record two. But now we're seeing the music industry shrink. They got greedy, and Napster really socked it to them. And yes, they sued Napster out of existence. They should have partnered with Napster, bought Napster out, see how to monetize the technology and compromise. But no, they sued it out of existence. And then Napster clones came about, LimeWire, Kazaa, and so many others. And eventually the music industry had to surrender to the technology industry. So now we have the music industry as a whole being at the mercy of the tech industry. That is that's one huge example of technology's influence on music. And so now Steve Jobs comes and says, look, we're going to sell songs, $1 per song. We're not going to group them in albums unless the person wants that. The music industry said, no, 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 no. And he said, okay, good luck suing all these other Napster clones out of existence. So they gave way to Steve Jobs. Music became even more portable, even cheaper. Then streaming comes. And now you don't even need a single playback device to access your music, because it's all in the cloud. You can have a phone and throw it out the window, log into your account on another phone, and your playlists, your virtual library is right there. Music is more accessible than ever. On a cheap little phone, you can have in your hand almost everything that has ever been recorded for free with commercials, or what is it, $11 or something like that, with no commercials on Spotify. If you want it in super high fidelity, you can go to Tidal or Qobuz HD tracks, download it in either 2496, 24192, or DSD. So the sky's the limit in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, and in terms of convenience. In many ways, it's a golden era for those who want to consume and receive music. But in terms of music's place in society, it seems to have gone a bit to the background. And one of the reasons for this is that one of the only ways that musicians can now make money is through merchandising. The streaming is not very, it doesn't generate a lot of income for most musicians. Physical sales can generate income, but not enough compared to what they did. So you need to go out and play live. But even when you're playing live, so much of it is depending on the merchandise. So much is depending on the vibe you're selling, the lifestyle you're selling. So if for musicians themselves, the music is now, as a financial consideration, secondary to selling a lifestyle and the merchandise to furnish that lifestyle, it's perhaps not surprising that for the music consumer, the music receiver, things are kind of slipping into the background. In other words, we're listening to this music not because Sexy Red's songs are that memorable to us, but because we like the vibe that Sexy Red is creating. Or we're hate listening, which wasn't really a thing before. Where let's say you hate Sexy Red. I don't mean to pick on her, but she's a prominent example of someone who rose to fame through TikTok, something that would have been impossible prior to the tech industry eating the music industry alive as it did in Steve Jobs' era, and it's only continued since then. So people watch her stuff and see, I said watch, not listen, because the visual component is now inseparable. It's not even complementary like it might have been in the MTV era. It's increasingly inseparable. So whether you like the lifestyle she's selling, whether you think she's corrupting the young, you'll be listening to her and watching her, but not necessarily because of the music. And so we've kind of come full circle. We've gone from music being in liturgical and folkish settings to being a thing in and of itself. Concert halls just for music, player pianos that you buy just for music, recorded sound devices made just for music, or at least mostly for music. You have records that were made mostly, in some cases, only for music. Now we're back to music being in the folkish setting. But instead of being at ye old public square, it's now in the digital public square. TikTok, X, YouTube, all of this stuff. And don't get me wrong, for the person who wants music and music alone or a live concert, it's better than ever because almost everything we want, we can have access to. But for the masses who have been oversaturated by non musical stimuli, we're seeing music go back to where it was before the modern era. It's something to drink to, it's something to think to, it's something to get stimulated by. It's not something that is the main attraction anymore. Will it be again? The technology exists to make it so, but it depends on how we use it. And that, my friends, is how everything from technology to architecture can affect the way that music is created and received. Let me know if you have a different point of view in the comments. And as always, like, subscribe, share this with your friends, and we will see you next time. Take care.